Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today I'm joined with one of my favorite authors, Charles Duhigg. How you doing, Charles?
Good, good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Well, wanted to bring Charles on the show. He has a new book out, Supercommunicators, which I'm just a fan of all his work. My wife's actually reading your book, which is great because she doesn't read anything I recommend. So I'm glad she's reading it. She came to that in her own conclusion, I'm sure.
Did she tell you to read The Power of Habit? Was that what happened? She said you need to improve your habits, and you told her, "Hey, here's a communication book."
It's a great marriage, let me tell you. Yeah, so Charles, for those of you who don't know you and your work, maybe you could tell listeners a little bit about your background and
Sure.
some of your work.
Yeah, I'm a reporter at the New Yorker magazine and used to be at the New York Times. And I've written a couple of books. The Power of Habit was my first one, and then I wrote one called Smarter, Faster, Better, which is about the science of productivity. And then this one, Super Communicators, about the science of communication. And I've always been a business reporter. I actually have an MBA from Harvard and had started a company before I went to business school, and then sold the company about midway through business school, and suddenly had this huge, wide open field to decide what I wanted to do. And telling stories about money and about business and about how we make choices around allocating scarce resources has always been fascinating to me. And so that's what I decided to do, was to become a business journalist. And I've really enjoyed it. And I mostly cover for the New Yorker tech and finance at this point.
Nice. Well, there's certainly plenty of stories in both of those areas.
Yeah.
What's been one of the most interesting stories you've covered?
Well, recently, I just had a piece that published a couple months ago about how Silicon Valley, and particularly crypto, was spending money in the most recent political race to influence who gets elected, and it was incredibly successful. So, about 50% of every corporate dollar in the 2024 political cycle came from crypto. Right, just a massive, massive amounts of money are now flowing into politics from tech. And in the past, it's really easy to waste money in politics. But they hired this guy, Chris Lahane. Coinbase actually brought him on. He now works for OpenAI, um, who is a political expert. He used to work in the Clinton White House. And he basically told them how to use their money in ways that can decide elections. And so I thought that was really interesting.
So I'm curious, so did the 50 of every dollar, was that from crypto itself or from the crypto industry?
The crypto
Okay.
industry. Yeah, not many of the donations were actually in crypto itself, right? Because the Trump campaign would accept crypto, but it's actually hard to make political donations with crypto because you have to sell the crypto almost immediately to make it into dollars. But hundreds of millions of dollars from the crypto industry, and in particular from just a handful of folks, Coinbase, Ripple, Andreessen Horowitz, those were really the big players who gave most of the money.
Nice. So I've always been curious about this because you had the crypto industry, which obviously has had a big push in the last whatever 4 years plus. Um, and there's definitely been some friction, right? People got really excited because they thought we'd have an SEC chairman that was very pro crypto and ended up being the opposite.
Yeah.
Um, and I always wondered why there's such pushback against adopting crypto.
Well, I think what's happened is that there is a group of skeptics in Washington D.C., right, who are, and you could kind of think of them as Gary Gensler, who's leaving as the SEC head, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, kind of being the heads of those. And the argument they make is this: they say, look, we have seen financial fads come and go, and the system that we have for protecting small investors against losing their money is essentially the securities laws that were put in place that the SEC oversees. And they're right, right? Like there are numerous instances of people selling unscrupulous assets, or selling assets that are designed to make the promoter make money and the investor lose money. And so what the SEC did, and the code of laws around the SEC, is it says, look, if you're selling one of these securities, you have to disclose a certain number of things. We're going to try and put some transparency protections in place, and we're going to hold you accountable to what you say. And so the argument that the SEC has been making is, crypto offerings, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are securities offerings. They're something that's sold by a promoter, and that promoter is selling it in order to make money. Now, the argument that the industry makes is they say, look, crypto is not a security. And there's actually a test in the law that they're sort of fighting over. But what the crypto industry is saying is, look, crypto is not a security, it's a currency, right? And we don't say that the US dollar is a security. We don't say that the yen is a security. This is no different. We think it's more like a commodity. And the SEC has agreed that Bitcoin and Ether are both commodities. But of course, there's thousands and thousands of other coins out there, right? And so that's the basic argument, is how much protection and transparency investors should have when they buy this product, and what the promoters who do a coin offering, what they should have to do in order to sell coins or to allow them to be traded.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found it to be fascinating because it's this new industry that's popped up, and people are trying to figure it out from a tax standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, and there's so much potential there, and yet it seems like everyone's just pushing back on it. You'd think, well, the industry has been very vocal about the fact that they want to work with the regulators to make it safe, and at least that's
Well,
what I've been hearing.
so the industry definitely wants to work with the regulators. The industry is asking for regulations, right? Which is good, but they're asking for their regulations, right? So it's not like the industry is coming in and saying, "Hey, look, we just want to sit down with each other and hold hands and find an answer we all agree on." What they're saying is, we think that there should be specific regulations that effectively recognize cryptocurrencies as commodities and therefore not regulated by securities laws. And I will say that I think now I will actually say I think the debate's pretty much over at this point. Like with Donald Trump's election, with the election, with the Senate and the House going to Republicans and even Democrats sort of saying we need regulations in place to allow crypto to succeed. I don't think we're going to see a lot of debate over this anymore. But there will be debate over what those regulations look like. If it was up to the industry, the regulations would be incredibly loose, right? I mean, the industry says that they want to stamp down on fraud, and I'm sure they do. But I think that the folks who are going to be deciding what the regulations are, the question they're going to be asking is, how many actual protections do we need in place? Like, if you're Joe Schmo and someone comes to you and they say, "Hey, do you want to buy a dentist coin?" Right, which is a cryptocurrency, a real cryptocurrency that was created for dentists by dentists. Do you want to buy a dentist coin? I think it's going to go up in value. How much should they tell you about how many dentist coins they own, how much of the market they control, whether they can push the price up or down basically by with a few transactions? Because otherwise, you're looking at a situation where there's an opportunity for a lot of pump and dump.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true for anything, right? I mean, that's why they have casinos. That's why there's, I mean, you could, there's always this balance, right, between investing, gambling, trading, whether it's crypto or
But
securities
usually
or
you know
casino.
which one it is when you walk in. And take gambling. Gambling is a great example. You're right, there are casinos, but casinos actually have very, very strict rules on what the payout and the odds have to be.
Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise you'd walk in and the slot machines would pay out the bare minimum it needs to pay out to get you to continue gambling. Or they would fix the game anytime, a hand got a pot got a certain size. So you're right. There's a lot. All investing is in a sense also taking a gamble, right? You're making a forecast, you're speculating. Um, but the question is, how much information ought you to have as the small investor compared to the person who's selling you that product? Compared to how much information should you have as the gambler compared to what the casino has to tell you and can keep obscured from you? Nobody's saying that crypto shouldn't exist. It's a debate over, and I think there's valid arguments on both sides of this. It's a debate over how much transparency ought to be in place for someone when they buy a coin.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think anybody would disagree with more transparency. I think the way it comes off to the public, though, certainly how I hear it, is it's a power grab. It's who wants power over who. The SEC, it feels like a power grab. I want to tell you guys what to do or not do. And of course, there's influences, and the banking sector has influences because it's taking over their turf in a way. So it comes across publicly as a power grab. Now, whether that's innately true behind the scenes, I don't know, but
No, I
that's
think
how
it
it
is. I think
feels.
everyone's, yeah, I mean, everything in politics is a little bit of a power grab, right? Because I'm trying to say, like, I should have the right to make this choice rather than you have the right to make this choice. And we can use arguments to sort of justify why we think that's right. But you're right. This is a there is an active battle that has been going on for the last 4 years between the SEC and the industry. But I think it's actually over now. I think it's been decided.
Nice. So all right, so that's one of the more interesting stories. That's great. Where do you um I- I'm curious well, a few ways. Where do you see crypto going? I mean, Silicon Valley obviously is heavily pushing this. There's obviously AI is in our future. But, from all your research and interviews with people, like where do you see things going in technology? Like what are the more interesting
Yeah.
areas that people should be
So
thinking
let me
about?
talk about tech more broadly than crypto because I'm not really a crypto expert at all. So I think that where tech is going, I mean, obviously, AI is going to be a huge force, a huge, force multiplier, a disruptive force. I think it's going to be uneven in how we get there, right? There's this saying in technology that people always overestimate the impact of a new technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. And I think that's going to be true about AI is that right now there's still people saying like AI is going to change the entire world in the next year or two. Like you'll never go to a doctor again, you'll just talk to a robot. And that's clearly not true, right? And there's already some backlash that we see manifesting among investors and consumers over the sort of breathless promises and fantasies that have been whipped up about AI. So in the short term, I think it's going to be a kind of rocky road to figure out how AI actually gets used by normal people. In the long term, I think it's going to really reorganize how we think about using computers. And computers is at the core now of most business and how it gets done. The real promise of generative AI is that I can program a computer just by talking to it. I can say, hey, it'd be really nice if my lights went on when I came into the room. And by the way, like, can you please like make sure that, hey, I want to go to Tahiti. Like, what's the best flight? Can you book that for me? And then AI will be able to take those spoken commands and will be able to make it happen. Right. That's sort of the Jetsons view of AI. I think that's the direction we're moving towards. And when computing becomes so ubiquitous that we hardly think about it, that will change how we do a lot of things. That will change medicine, that will change finance, that will change consumption, right? There's the question of whether you need to go on Amazon and search for the product you want is going to be changed by just saying like, "Oh, he has a cool watch, get me that watch." So I think that there will be lots of long-term impacts from AI. It's difficult to say how quickly they're going to come and what path it's going to take. So I'd say that's the biggest thing I see in tech right now is AI. The other thing I see is frankly just like, look, when interest rates are high, it's hard to invest in new companies, right? And yet there is a ton of money still sitting out there that has to get invested by private equity funds because they've got, their 7-year investment window. And so in the past, we have seen these periods of frothy investment when and propping up companies that really shouldn't have been propped up. I don't think we're in that right now, in part because interest rates are high. But we are going to see a reckoning probably within private equity over the next 10 or 5 years, I would say, in terms of winners and losers. There's too many people doing it right now and too many folks who don't know what they're doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I've felt that way for quite a few years now. I talk with a lot of private equity investors and fund managers, and I think it was maybe like I don't know 4 or 5 years ago. I think it was right before COVID. I was talking to one of them, and I was like, "Oh, so what do you think of, what are your favorite investments?" He's like, "I wouldn't invest in any of the stuff we're investing in.
Right.
Like it's just junk. It's overpriced." And he's like, but we have to put it to work." And
You
he's a
don't
good
get you don't
manager.
get your 2 and 20 if you don't put it to work. So you got to do it.
Yeah, you got to find something to put it in. And That seems to be the path, and it's kept going. I mean, some of the stuff that people are investing in. So, I mean, based on kind of what you've seen, like, where do you see that going? Because it's an endless supply of money going in there, and they just don't seem to care.
So I think there's two scenarios. One is that we just get used to lower yields, right? That the private equity funds and alternative investments and the stock market, which has been just on a tear lately, that we reach a period that kind of like the 70s and the 60s where there's steady growth or there's stagnancy, but like these like huge returns that we see are sort of an aberration as opposed to the norm. That's one possibility. The second possibility is what happened before 2008, where people find some new product and they just start chasing yield. In that case, it was mortgage-backed securities and other forms of collateralized debt obligations. I'm not seeing, and they might be out there and I'm just not hearing about them yet. I haven't seen new products emerging yet that sort of offer a different type of risk and offer high yield as a result. Oftentimes with those products, once they become too popular, it turns out that different type of risk is like the same type of risk you have in your portfolio. And so it ends up blowing up on you. SPACs is a good example of this, right? SPACs was something that where everyone was chasing yield. And the folks who got in early did pretty well. The folks who got in late got decimated. And so my guess is that we'll see waves of new products that are offering yield, and we'll see people rushing into them. And then some of them will do well and they'll be sustaining, and some of them will blow up. Crypto is a good example, right? Like a lot of people are putting money into crypto because it offers yield. And that's exactly when I talk to the SEC. This is what they say. They say, look, the same thing happened in the 1930s, right? In that case, it was called mutual funds instead of crypto. It was the fancy new thing that everyone wanted to pour their dollars into. In the 1980s, it was junk bonds. And when you don't have protections in place, the guys who get in early, who have the most money, they end up doing pretty well. It's all the small investors who just get blown up.
Yeah, I mean, it's been funny because ever since they started raising rates, one of the best performing fixed income was U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah.
Had some of the highest yield if you compare it. And that's not this crazy concoctions that you're talking about that they'll come up with to increase it, but you were able to get really good yields just from U.S. Treasuries. But it does bring up the interesting point of the creative stuff. So they did have crypto lending, which has been going on for, I don't know, a long time, and the SEC has been really against it. And I don't really know the basis behind it because I know that people have been doing similar things, which to me is interesting. So you basically you have your crypto, you borrow off it, or you lend it to somebody else, and you get paid, and then they pay you back. And if crypto goes down, then you basically you lose the crypto because you're leveraged.
Right.
So it's not safe, obviously, but I find it interesting that people are willing to do it. And I was talking to somebody about it, and it related to another conversation I had a few years ago with a guy who has a gold and silver dealer kind of model. And what they were doing is they would acquire gold, like raw, not coins, but just metal in some shape or form. And what they would do is they would lend the gold to like a jeweler who'd go make their stuff, and then they pay him back. Um, and so you could basically take your gold and give them your gold, lend it to this other person who would pay you back in gold. So if you have 1,000 ounces of gold and they give you back 50 ounces of gold as interest, which I
Right.
thought to be a really fascinating lending model, especially for people who like gold because they're into gold, not money. But then from what I hear, the SEC really didn't like that, and I don't
Well,
know if they cracked down, but it was
yeah, I think what happens in cases like that is, so if I own gold and I loan you some of my gold, that's totally fine. I'm allowed to do that. But if I take gold from a depositor and then I lend it out to another person, in that case, what I'm doing is I'm becoming a bank, right? That's how banks make money. And I think, and it's not really the SEC. It's more like the whole federal. It's really the Fed. What the Fed says is, look, if you're a bank, if you're taking deposits from one person and you're lending them out to another person, then you kind of have this mismatch, right, in obligations and liabilities and assets. Um, in that case, what you have to do is you have to have certain safety cushions in place, right? Like you have to have a certain amount of deposits that you hold that you don't lend out, so that if somebody says, "Hey, I want my deposit back," you can give it to them right away. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to say to crypto or any industry that doesn't consider itself a bank, you're behaving like a bank, and we think you should exist by the bank rules around safety and compliance. And that's, I think, where that dispute takes place. But if I own gold and I lend it to you, nobody really cares about that, right? Because like then I'm just taking a risk on you, and that's a risk that I can take. I'm underwriting it because I know you. But it's when I take a deposit from someone else and I loan it out, and that's what was happening with crypto, right? Like FTX is a great example of this. FTX would take in a ton of deposits from crypto holders, and then they would lend out or use or invest those holdings into other things that blew up. That's where the government wants to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense as a model, but I wonder because they also wouldn't allow crypto in banks.
Yeah, no, that's
That's
absolutely true.
so it's
That's
like if you require that's the model, but you can't use it. So
Well, yeah. So what they told Coinbase, so Coinbase actually basically adheres to banking laws, right? Because there's other laws too, like money laundering. Know your customer. And so Coinbase sort of voluntarily has said, look, even if we don't think we have to, we're gonna abide by banking laws, and we're gonna agree with you. We're a bank, and so you could set up a crypto bank, and Coinbase has done that. It's just the question is for exchanges where people are exchanges that are facilitating these kinds of transactions that don't consider themselves banks. That's where the tension lies.
yeah, that makes sense. Um, so I do want to talk about your book a little bit because I'm curious. So
Sure.
what's the um why did you decide to write the book Supercommunicators? Just out of curiosity.
Actually, kind of for the same reason that I wrote The Power of Habit. With The Power of Habit, basically, I had this question, which is like, if I'm so smart, why can't I like lose weight and exercise more easily? And so I started calling experts and saying, like, how do I change my habits? And if I told them I was writing a book, they would pick up my call. And so very similarly with communication, I found that I fell into this pattern both at work and at home that I wasn't communicating as well as I wanted. I'd like, for instance, I'd come home from work and I'd be talking to my wife and complaining about my day. My boss doesn't appreciate me, and my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife would offer me this good advice. She'd say something like, "Why don't you take your boss out to lunch and get to know each other better?" And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say, like, you're supposed to be on my side. Why aren't you telling me that I'm right? And she would get upset because I was attacking her. You're laughing because I'm assuming that something similar happens. Yeah, this happens in all our relationships, right? And so I just got really curious, like, why does this happen? Why does this happen at home, at work? Why do people miscommunicate when they want to work together? And I went to experts, and the experts said this kind of interesting thing. They said, we're glad you showed up right now because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. Because of advances in data collection and neural imaging, we can essentially see what's happening in someone's brain when they're having a conversation. And they said the biggest thing that we've discovered is that when we have a discussion, we tend to assume that that discussion is about one thing, right? Like we're talking about where to go on vacation or how my day was. But they said actually inside your brain, what's happening is every discussion you have is made up of different kinds of conversations. And these kind of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's like practical conversations where we're solving problems together, making plans. There's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations about how we relate to each other and the identities that are important to us. And they said what happens is if two people are having different kinds of conversations at the same moment, they cannot hear each other, not fully. And they definitely cannot connect with each other. That's what was happening with me and my wife, right? I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. But they said, if you start having the same kind of conversation, what's known in psychology as the matching principle. If you match each other, if I match you and I invite you to match me, then even if we disagree with each other, we feel a sense of connection. We feel a sense of trust in each other. And so I thought that was really interesting. So that was kind of the basis of the book.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned all the data that's being collected now in this golden age, and I'm curious on your take on this because I've thought about this too. There's some people who are just naturally gifted in influence and persuasion. And there's certain principles I think that they have, and I think of it as like a superpower, right? Like you can connect with almost anybody. A lot of presidents have it in different forms. Like Bill Clinton was extremely charismatic. I know a lot of people don't like Donald Trump, but he's got some very high-end skill when it comes to influence persuasion. And people have met him said the same thing. They feel like, it's all about you, not him, when you walk in the room.
Yeah.
So, but I think anybody of power has to have that at some degree, or else you don't get there. So my question to you is this: in this golden age where they're able to collect this data and able to use it, you have companies like Facebook who've used it in maybe less than ethical ways, and some other tech companies who've done that. Like, where does this go? Because once, decades ago when I was growing up, nobody knew anything. It's just like
Yeah.
you happen to be
Right.
gifted at something or didn't. Like, you're
Well,
good at
so
sports or
it's
you're not.
interesting.
It's like,
There's a lot. So the book is made up of stories, right? There's stories about like a CIA officer who's sent overseas to recruit spies and is just terrible at it at first. And there's a story about Netflix, how Netflix kind of with its weird and somewhat caustic culture managed to get people to work together. And or like a story about The Big Bang Theory, that TV show that's a hit, why it became a hit. And the thing that you find again and again and again in the research is that what we're talking about, super communication, being a good communicator, it is actually not a natural inborn trait. It's just a set of skills. And they're skills that anyone can learn. Anyone can become a super communicator. And why that's important is because if you talk to folks like Bill Clinton, or if you talk to other folks like Donald Trump, or people who seem like consistent super communicators, and you ask them, have you always been good at communication? One of the things they'll say is no. Like in high school, I had trouble making friends and I had to study how kids talk to each other. Or in Bill Clinton's case, I had parents who fought with each other and I had to be the peacemaker between them. It's the act of thinking about communication that typically makes us a better communicator. And the book goes through a set of skills that super communicators possess. But these are skills that all of us have at one time or another, right? We all are super communicators at some point. When you're talking to your best friend, when you're talking to your wife, you are a super communicator for them. And they're a super communicator back for you. The only difference is that there are skills you are using with your spouse or with your best friend. And once you recognize them as skills and you practice using them with other people, they become habits. And it's at that moment that you're a super communicator with everyone. So even the most unlikely folks, there's a story about this FBI officer who basically was really shy and he ended up becoming the top negotiator in the FBI just because he learned and thought a little bit more about how the communication works and he recognized these skills.
you're talking about Chris Voss.
No. It's another guy. Chris works in the negotiations unit, but this is another guy who is anonymous. He goes by Felix Segala.
Okay.
And his job is actually still so important that he doesn't want his name shared with the world.
It's fascinating to me, as I think about this a lot. I mean, you raised a good point about people who had that kind of childhood who focused on communicating. I mean, my family, everybody was very bad at communicating. Like, they were just, we're all introverts, and I'm a forced extrovert, even though I'm an introvert. And so I always find it interesting because I always had to focus on it because it's like, well, people aren't understanding me. What can I do better to have them understand me? You hear people like Tony Robbins talk about his experience in childhood and what it's helped him turn into. Um, so how can people pick up these skills? Because some people are just naturally gifted in certain ways. Naturally gifted meaning, childhood or experience or whatever. But how can people be thinking about improving their skills and being a better
Yeah.
communicator with the people that are important to them?
So there's a handful of skills, and the book goes through them. The first and probably the most important one is learning to ask questions, but asking the right kind of questions. So within psychology, there's a type of question known as a deep question. And a deep question is important because it asks us about our values, our beliefs, our experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's as simple as like if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? That second question, what made you decide to go to medical school? That's an invitation for someone to tell me, first of all, who they really are, right? They're going to tell me something about their values and their beliefs, maybe their experiences, what it was like at medical school. But equally, it's also going to tell me what kind of mindset they're in. I mentioned those three kinds of conversations: the practical, the emotional, and the social. If I know what kind of mindset you're in, I know how to match you and how to feel connected. And oftentimes asking a deep question prompts the person to say something that tells me what kind of mindset they're in. So take that question I asked, what made you decide to become a doctor? Someone might answer that by saying, I really wanted a job that, like, I always knew that it was going to be a steady job. Like I grew up and my dad was in and out of work and I wanted a steady paycheck. Okay. That's a person who right now is in a practical mindset. I can hear that, but I also learned something about his youth. That same person in a completely different setting, maybe later in the day or in a different place, they might say something like, part of it was a paycheck, but also when I was a kid, I saw my dad get sick, and these doctors came in, and they were these healers, and I wanted to be one of those healers. I wanted to feel that way. Okay, that's a person who's in a more emotional mindset right now. But again, I've learned something about their past. And the thing about deep questions, the reason why this skill, asking deep questions, is so important is because when I ask you a deep question, it's really easy for me to answer my own question gracefully. Oh, you became a doctor because you saw your dad get sick. I became a lawyer because I saw my uncle get arrested when I was a kid, right? And now we're talking about things that actually matter. We're talking about the fact that we both grew up with some challenges, and it shaped what we believe in and what we value and what we try and do as adults. So the first most important skill is learning to ask deep questions. And that usually means not asking people about the facts of their life, but instead asking them how they feel about their life.
Okay. So, what other skills would be important? I mean, I love that one. That one to me seems like you could just do that all day, and
Yeah.
people would just love talking to you because they're talking about themselves, right? Which is their favorite
But you're
topic is
right.
me.
That's not enough. That's not enough, right? Because particularly, and if you're at a dinner party, then deep questions is enough. Like, I ask you a question about your background, and then I say, "Oh, actually, I had something similar," and we're off to the races. We're both talking about ourselves, and we're sharing things, and we're feeling connected. But many of the conversations we have, particularly the most important conversations, are more meaningful because they're harder, right? We're talking about something that we both feel a little bit of tension over. We might disagree with each other. We might be talking about politics. We might be talking about money with our spouses, and that oftentimes brings up some emotions that people aren't even aware of. So during those moments when we're having what are known within the literature as conflict conversations, or a little bit more challenging conversations, or more important conversations, in addition to asking questions and asking deep questions, we also need to do something else. We need to prove to the person that we're talking to that we are paying attention and listening to them. So for a long time, people felt like listening was enough. If I just listen to you and I absorb what you're saying, then I've done my job. But what we found is that for most people, when you're listening to me, particularly in something where we disagree with each other, there is this sneaking suspicion in the back of my brain that you are not listening. You're just waiting your turn to speak. So in order to show you that that's not true, I have to prove to you that I'm listening. And there's actually a technique for this that they teach at Harvard and Stanford and a bunch of other fancy places. That's called looping for understanding. And it works like this. It has 3 steps. Step 1 is that you ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? Let the person respond. Step 2 is you repeat back what you just heard them say in your own words. And what's important here is the goal is not mimicry. The goal is matching. It's proving to the person that you're paying attention. It's proving to the person that you're actually thinking about what they're saying. What I heard you say was this, and that made me think of this other thing that you once said. So that's step 1 and step 2. And most of us do that a little intuitively. Step 3 is the one that I always forget. Step 3 is that once you've kind of recapped and proved what the person said, once you've proved to them that you're paying attention, then you ask, did I get that right? Because when I ask you, am I hearing you correctly? Oh, what I heard you say was this. Am I hearing that right? Am I getting what you're trying to tell me? When I say that, what I'm actually doing is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And one of the things about how our brains have evolved is that if you acknowledge that I am listening, you become much more likely to listen to me in return. So if I prove to you that I'm listening to you, you're going to listen to me. And that's another and really important skill that super communicators have. They prove that they are listening. And I think we've all felt that in conversations, right? When we're talking to someone, when we're talking to our best friend, we know that they're paying attention. They make it obvious they're paying attention. And it sort of feels wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like every salesperson in America needs this skill. Like,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But it can't be mimicry, right? It has to
right.
be authentic. Like I can't basically be listening to you to be like, okay, I'm going to mention X, Y, and Z because that's what he just said. I have to actually be paying attention and prove to you that I'm processing it.
Yeah, because I talk to a lot of salespeople, especially in my industry, and I find that one of the biggest challenges they have is they talk and then they ask a question only to get to the next question. They don't really
Right.
care about the answer and they're not willing to drill down and like, oh, how much money do you have for retirement? Like, well, and they go off in this story and they're like, come on, just answer the question. Like, okay, I need to get my next question. And they're not
Right.
really having a conversation. It's more like data gathering, which you could just pull off a sheet of paper. Um, and they wonder why they're not getting any sort of interest.
Yeah. Well, and it's useful to explain what exactly happens in our brains when we're having a conversation. So when we have a real conversation, a back and forth, when we start to feel connected to each other, or we're just understanding each other, our bodies and our brains start to change. Without realizing it, even in this conversation, our heart rates have become more similar. Our breath patterns have become more similar. Most importantly, the activity inside our brains has become more and more alike. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually experience that emotion a little bit, right? And if I tell you about an idea, you experience that idea. So it makes sense that our brains become similar. But what research has shown, and particularly by a guy named Uri Hassan, who's at Princeton, is that the more and more our brains become similar, the more and more they become in sync, the better we understand each other and the more we hear about what the other person is saying and the more we feel connected to each other. So when that salesman is calling a client and that person is saying, well, I'm worried about the future because, what if the aliens come? And they're just like, whatever, just give me the number. What they're doing is they're making their brain different from the brain of the person they're speaking to. Right. This is why this matching thing is so important, is because if I'm using the same parts of my brain that you're using, it's easier for us to become what's known within psychology or neuroscience as neurally entrained. And as a salesperson, when I become entrained with someone, that's when I become persuasive. That's when they like me. That's when suddenly they start to trust me. But if I'm asking you a question just as a pretext and I'm not really paying attention to the answer, and the response I give you has very little to do with what you just said, then we're not becoming more entrained. In fact, what I'm doing is I'm sort of proving that I'm on a different wavelength than you are. And people can feel that. Our brains have become very, very well adapted to detect when someone is not on the same wavelength as us.
Interesting. Um, one more question in the interest of time here. I know you got a hard deadline. So, one final question, we can kind of wrap it up. So you mentioned there's three different types of conversations. How do your how do approaches for each one vary? Right. So I assume people are people, so there's probably a lot of overlap, but the different kind of conversations, how should people be thinking about those differently and how
Yeah.
to apply a lot of what you've talked about?
So the most important thing is this matching. That if I'm signaling to you that I'm in a practical mindset, that you should kind of meet me there a little bit. Or more importantly, if I'm in an emotional mindset, you should say, like, I hear what you're feeling. What I hear you saying is X and Y and Z. Can we talk about solutions now? Like, do I have your permission to move from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation? So that's the most important thing, is to notice what kind of conversation is happening and match it and invite others to match you. But you are right. Each conversation type has essentially a slightly different goal. When we're having a practical conversation, our goal is to make a decision, right? And that decision can just be like, you and I both agree that this is right and we should move forward with it. We can also disagree, right? We can say, like, you're going to vote for your guy and I'm going to vote for my guy, but we both agree that security is important and we just see this differently. So the goal that we're pushing towards in a practical conversation is a decision. In an emotional conversation, it's very different. In an emotional conversation, I tell you my emotion. I want you to empathize. I don't want you to solve my emotion. I don't want you to help me make a decision right away. I want you to tell me that you are hearing and feeling what I am feeling and that it is valid. In a social conversation, when we're talking about how we relate to each other and in society, the goal is simply acknowledgement. To say, like, look, I understand as a, what you've told me is that as a woman, you see this issue differently than I do as a man. And I want you to know, I hear that. Like, that's very valid. You have had different experiences than I have. So these three conversations, there's a lot of overlap, right? And in a discussion, you'll move from between all three. You'll start practical and then go emotional, and then go back to practical and then social. What's important is that you're moving together. And once we become aligned, once I come home and I say, I'm having a terrible day, and my wife says, I'm really sorry you're having a terrible day. It just sounds like that sucks. I totally know what that's like. And I feel for you. At that moment, when she says, do you want me just to listen to you, or do you want me to help you find some solutions for this? Do you want to have an emotional conversation, or do you want to have a practical conversation? At that moment, we become aligned. And once we're aligned, we tend to move through that conversation in alignment. We'll shift from conversation type to conversation type. But it's worth sort of keeping the reason why there's like, these are big buckets, right? There's a lot of conversations that but by keeping the buckets in your head, they're easy to keep in your head. And it just helps us remember, like, if somebody's talking about something that's kind of emotional, if they're saying, like, oh, I went and I saw my kid's graduation this weekend. Like, the best way that we can connect with them is to say, oh my gosh, that's amazing. What did that feel like? Rather than saying, oh my gosh, congratulations. Okay, let's get down to business. Here's the agenda.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. I appreciate that, Charles, and I appreciate you coming to the show and sharing your wisdom with us. Always enjoy your work. What are some final thoughts you can leave us with, and where can people find more about you?
Yeah. So if you want to buy Supercommunicators or The Power of Habit, they're both available online on Amazon. If you want to listen to them, many people enjoy listening to it. I actually read Supercommunicators myself. It's on Audible. Anywhere you buy books, Barnes and Nobles, that they have it. Also, your local independent bookseller. And then I'll mention, I actually have a newsletter that I send out. Kind of full. It's called The Science of Better, with basically trying to find things from academic papers and explain how we can use them in our life to become more successful. And you can find that by going to my website, charlesduhigg.com, or by Googling Charles Duhigg, or Googling Supercommunicators, or Googling The Power of Habit. And then I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook and all of those.
Awesome. Well, Charles, I really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your wisdom. This is awesome. I love it. I'm a fanboy, so love your work. Keep it up. It's funny, you guys. I know you guys sent me a book here for the interview. I already had one, so my wife was reading it. I'm like, great, I got my own version now. I can read it.
Well, thank you for having me on. This has been such a treat.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Yeah, I'm sure you'll put out some books in the future. Look forward to having you on again. So thank you again.
Will do. Absolutely.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
All right. Well, that was a great interview with Charles. Really appreciate him coming on the show. Always love his books, and I highly recommend listeners go out and read them. They're great. If you're into that sort of self-improvement, which I imagine you are, you'd be listening to the show. So now we're to the panel portion of the show where we have our very own Barb Freeberg. Hey, Barb.
Hi, Kirk. Hi, Phil.
Good to see you. And we also have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk. Hey, Barb. Good to see you both.
Yeah. Yeah, good to have you both here. I'm wearing my winter hat because it's today is the first day of backyard ice skating, so I'm outside skating all day when I'm not doing podcasts episodes. So it's a few days before Christmas, and it's pretty much Christmas here because we get to skate all day. So Barb, what were some of your takeaways from the interview with Charles?
I like the discussion of his book. He's obviously a very smart and well-researched guy. But I also like to talk about crypto and AI because despite them being very, very trendy, they are both having impacts on society today. Crypto on anyone who's an investor, whether they invest in it or not. And AI is everywhere. And it will in some way impact every job and everyone's life.
Yeah, agreed. Phil, what about you? What were some of your takeaways?
So I've heard a lot of Charles talk a lot before. He is, as Barb said, he is a brilliant guy. I loved his comments about communication because I know when I work as a life planner, that stuff is so important, how you communicate with clients, make sure that they give them a chance to be heard.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, Barb, let's start with you. So, how do communication skills and learning how to communicate well, what are the kind of the practical applications for people they can take away from this?
Well, I liked his idea of asking deep questions because that was something that I had never heard before. And it's pretty common knowledge that when you're meeting someone new, a way to connect with them is to ask them about themselves. But the idea of asking them a deep question, which is not what do you do, but how did you decide to become a doctor? Or how did you decide to go down this path? Really opens the door to a different type of intimate communication. That and really listening. And I don't know about you guys, but I have to work at listening because it doesn't come naturally. And so I always appreciate a reminder of how to listen and the importance of listening.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a very valuable skill. Phil, what about you? What are some of your takeaways? I know you mentioned you use it for some of your clients, but what can some of the listeners take away from this?
I think it's really important. Barb said, I think before, the idea that everybody loves to talk, right? And so if you walk away from a conversation, you talked a lot. You usually think it's a good conversation, but really a good conversation is when you let the other person talk and let them be heard. It makes such a big difference. And so it means sometimes you have to repeat some of the things that they said to let them know that you're listening. And sometimes it just means keeping quiet and being comfortable with silence and letting them think and speak out loud what their thoughts. That really makes a big difference when you're trying to get to know a person and understand what's important to them, things like that. It's really important that you just listen, and we do want to talk. And we hear somebody say something and our response is, "Oh, I did this," or "I went there and this is what I did. What did you think of that?" But that takes the conversation away from them and makes it focus back on you. So if they say that they went someplace, those deepening questions are really good because then you give them a chance to expand on what they talk about and go deeper. And that's how you get really meaningful conversation and really meaningful information when you're having a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes into certainly a lot of directions. I'm in the middle of reading the book now. Um, and it talks about, just for an example, like, does somebody want to be helped, hugged, or heard? it kind of sounds good, and it makes for a good imagery there. But at the same time, people want different things, right? Anyone who's married knows this. You talk to your spouse, and they probably want something different than what you want. It's very common. If it's not common, then maybe you're not married. I don't know. It just seems like everyone goes through this. But I think the reality is when no matter who you're talking to, whether it's a coworker or your spouse or your kids, or you're talking to a peer at work, or you're talking to or you're trying to analyze a company, right? You need to understand what people are looking for in the conversation, because some people, men especially, fall prey to this. Is that men want to solve problems, right? It's a practical approach. Let's just turn me on, help me solve this problem, I'll go do it. But when somebody just wants to be heard, we're not so good at that, because we just want to solve the problem. It brings me to this. If anyone's ever seen that video called The Nail, anyone see that one? It's brilliant. It really is. And if you haven't seen it, I'll try to put a link to it in the show notes, but I don't want to spoil it. But I think both men and women will both understand from watching the video. But the point being is being a better communicator, I think, is a key to success in life. I know this is less investing focused, but we're doing this right before Christmas and the New Year. It's a good time to refresh, to think about areas in your life that you want to improve, and communication is certainly one of them. So yeah, so Barb, I know we also talked about crypto and AI in the interview, and what's interesting is obviously you think about the new age of communication. When all three of us, when we grew up and we were raised, there was computers weren't a way of communicating. You had person-to-person communications. You had the phone. That was pretty much it. Now people text each other. They've got 50 million different forms of communication. So how does this look going forward? You've got AI, for example, that's going to be doing the communicating for most people. How can people utilize this new technology and use that to their advantage to become good communicators?
Everywhere I turn, I start to write, and then I get a little message that says, "Do you want AI to do this for you?" And I think that's a reality. And so, oh gosh, I don't want to go down this road. I really don't. But I think face-to-face communication still matters. I mean, when you want to connect with someone, especially in a professional way or a personal way, look, you don't have to come face to face with them in person, but seeing them, for example, on Zoom, having a video call, it creates an entirely different experience. And when we'll just use business because that's pretty much what we talk about here. When you are negotiating, when you are selling, you are transacting, being able to talk to the person, look them in the eye, and get a sense of who they are and what they're about, that matters. And I think in that respect, I don't think there's a replacement for AI. I don't think AI is a replacement. Now, all the other stuff with writing, yeah, I mean, look, I actually don't mind it when I ask Google a question, they summarize it at the top. And if I want to go deeper, I just go to the sources. That's convenient. Or sometimes I'll have them do research for me. I'm a writer. I don't like Google, I don't want AI to write for me. But for gathering information, it can be a helpful start. But I don't believe AI is the last answer for everything because it misses stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's 80, the 80-20. It's got the 80, it doesn't have the 20, and the 20 is the stuff that matters at this point. Maybe it'll get there. Right now, I'm not seeing it, but it's good for the basic stuff, blocking, tackling, but it's not good for human communication yet. Phil, what about you? Where do you think communication's going in the new era with AI and all the new technology coming out?
The biggest concern I have about communication is I feel like the art of communication, when we're talking about that personal face to face, it's being lost. I mean, I have 4 kids and I look at them and yes, they're all different, but some of them, like, they don't want to talk to people. It's all about texting back and forth. When it comes time to talk to people, it can be really hard. And we think about how so many people have been working from home, and that takes away some of that communication. If I think back to the beginning of my career, being in the office and being able to go to somebody and say, hey, let's go to lunch, or I'm looking at this, but I'd like to talk it through because I'm not sure that I understand it. And finding somebody that you could do that with, that really helped. It's the mentoring, it's the camaraderie, it's all those things that come when you're working with around other people and you're talking to them as opposed to exchanging messages. It's hard for me to think that AI can replace that. Look, I like to write too, and I don't want AI to write for me, but it can help me write better. And I was writing my blog earlier today, and I know that it makes suggestions, and some of them I don't like, but some of them like, yeah, that really is better than the way that I wrote it. So it can improve your communication skills. It can make it more concise. I mean, writing isn't about saying things with the most words. It's about saying more with fewer words. And so things that can help with that are worthwhile, but I just don't see it, at least where it is today, just kind of totally taking over because I don't know where I think that human element in communication is so important.
Yeah, I agree totally. Well, as we kind of wrap it up here, final thoughts here, Barb, from you.
I like the idea of continuing to learn, whatever area you're in. And Charles Duhigg is a wonderful resource, both in all of his books, to help us just become better. And so my final thoughts are just continue to learn, continue to try things to see what works for you. I'm Barbara Friedberg. You can find me on YouTube and at Barbara Friedberg Personal Finance.
Thanks, Barb. Phil, final thoughts from you.
Communication is really important, as is continuous learning. I know I read all the time. And why? Because the more I read, the more I can learn. And I think that's really important. And having people like Charles that can help, his books are very helpful in terms of helping you develop better habits to communicate better. All those things are really important. So don't forget about them when you're thinking about how you want to advance and grow yourself. As for me, I know that experiencing big life transitions can be stressful. My job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. My firm's Apprise Wealth Management. We'd love to get to know you. If you're facing a new beginning, you can take our Flourish Through Life's Big Changes assessment at apprisewealth.com/assessment to discover how ready you are to embrace and thrive through your significant life transition. You can also sign up for our blog. Thanks for having me today, Kirk.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Phil, and thanks for sharing your wisdom with us as well. Thank you both.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.